Okay, so starting off here, this is where I begin my hands study on this page, and it's just a quick experiment that I tried, and I thought if I include this just to show you my approach, and what I'm going to do is show you a real-time sketch after this. So this is my hands holding a charcoal and graphite block tin and using the Mars Lumograph black pencils. So that's what's going to happen in this video, but it's going to be in real time, and I'll tell you all the decisions that I make along the way as a bit of a tutorial. Hello and welcome to Simon Says Artwork. In this video I'm going to be doing some nighttime drawing, as you can tell. So I'm going to be drawing a nice little nighttime sketch session. I thought I might share it with you. So okay, let's get started. Well, when it comes to drawing hands, I stick by it's one of two different approaches. I either do shadows only, where you don't even draw the outline for the hand, but if I am going to draw an outline for a hand, then I do it this way. And it's almost like the Barg method of drawing, but I haven't actually practiced and learnt the Barg method, so this is just basic block shapes to cut off any type of transitional angles and just to get an overall large shape boxed off on the page to sculpt more carefully afterwards. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. I'm getting the knuckles and the shape of a fist just blocked out, where if there's a large separation between any fingers, then I put that in, but otherwise I save the division until that there, where you can see I've put in little dash lines for where everything else separates. It takes a while for it to look like a good hand or fist shape. But once I've got this blocky outline, that's when I can start to go a little bit darker and commit to certain angles and rounded shapes of the knuckles. And I also start to lightly score in shapes for the shadows. And I quite like the hatching approach. So that's what I'm doing here, is hatching in lightly some of the shadow shapes early on. It just helps it show a 3D shape quicker, because at this point you're still looking at something which doesn't look convincingly like a fist. And it does take a bit of work to really push things around and get it looking a little bit more convincing. Now, if I were drawing this from imagination, I know this isn't how I would draw a fist, so it's all still quite fascinating to me to view the photo reference and observe all of the little details that make up a human fist. Just like the shape of the thumb. The way that it curls round and bulges is not how I would imagine it. I think I'd have it crossing over the fingers more horizontally, whereas instead it just arches up and bulges out. And where the light hits is not where I'd imagine it would have. But that's what makes drawing from reference so fascinating and so educational. Everything beyond this point becomes very sensitive and delicate, and you do want to make sure that you're paying close attention to where the light is. And so long as you're focused on the light and you really minimize where you put the shadow, then you should come out with something which is representing a light source quite strongly. And I think that's what makes drawing quite impactful. If you can see shadow and light well represented, then it's usually a lot more visually engaging, in my experience anyway. Parts of this drawing which I like are the reference having the to the index finger and the middle finger lifted and separated from the ring finger and the little finger. That difference in how a fist is clenched makes it a really nice shape to draw, a really nice image to study, and it just makes the drawing so much more pleasant, I suppose, to draw and to look at afterwards. It's the different planes, the different angles, and how much light they're capturing. Or catching, sorry, not capturing, catching. Now there are subtle transitional points here. You can see that I've done that on the index finger, how it slopes upwards and then curves down towards the knuckles. And that's something which is worth observing and including as well. If you make everything too straight and too uniformed, it doesn't look organic. And so long as your first lines are wispy and light, you can always go in heavier afterwards and correct some of the angles and add bits of curves and nuance in this later stage. But you can see there, that's a quick rendering of a fist, and it's all mid-tone hatching on top. So I need a bit more darker shadow on top of that again, just like on the hands at the top where it's got a mid-tone and then it's got a shadow layer. So I will need a shadow layer on top as well to really give that some depth. But because I've got that far, I know that it's almost finished. So instead I start on the second hand. Now this one is a little bit more difficult. The reason I find this more difficult is because fists have a really specific bulky shape which you can block out fairly quickly, whereas elongated palms don't. They are stretched out and it's tricky to get the proportions right. But it's just try it and see how it works out. If it doesn't work out right, then it's not the end of the world. You've learned something. But I always try to honour the reference as closely as possible. And then any decisions that I make which are outside of the reference is only to serve the piece itself or its placement on the page, so long as it doesn't detract from the piece. So for example, I think the photo reference may be slightly longer than I've done the palm, but I've kept it at this length so that it's comfortably sat on the page and proportional with the other hand. So I start to get in some of the details to show the different transitions, such as the little crevices in the pouches at the ends of the fingers where it meets the inside of the knuckles, and the same on the thumb. And then I start to get some very light hatching on the transitional points on the palm of the hand. These little shadow shapes which I am drawing in there are just to aid me in creating this 3D illusion. And my interest again is to create a mid-tone hatching shadow coverage over the hand so that I can see what's working and what isn't, because the drawing does change dramatically depending on whether it's a line drawing or a drawing with some level of shading in it. And make sure to curve off the tips of the fingers. There strangely is a temptation to keep them squared, and sometimes that can look quite nice, but on this occasion I honour the reference and round them off so that it's not too overly stylised, because I don't have a reason to do that really. The hatching itself is a stylistic choice. I used to always shade and I will be doing a video on how I do shading in order to try to make the direction of the pencil shading disappear. That's a really nice trick that I learned years ago, so I'll share that at some point. But for the time being, I'm doing one direction of hatching as the shading. There's no cross hatching, it's all just in one direction, because I think that that has quite a nice effect as well. Now, it's rare that I do this, but if there is the need at some point to erase some of the lines, then there's no shame or harm in doing that, because it's pencil drawing. I use the nice Blackwing Pencils edge eraser and just pull back some of these lines. Now, I am looking back here now to think about getting in the darker shapes, because I have the darker Mars Lumograph pencil in hand. I believe I do. Let's see. Perhaps it's not. I may have just pushed the outline of the knuckle on the fist drawing at the top, because you can see on the little finger there's a shape to the knuckle and then the drop to the finger, which was worth including. So perhaps that was the lighter pencil. It's hard to tell because I don't make a deal of showing that to the camera. I cut down the thickness of the thumb in order to be proportional with the rest of the hand, and it is worth ensuring that you keep an eye on things like that, just to make sure that you've not got a big bulbous thumb that's unrealistically fat compared to the other digits. If you hear any background noise, any tapping, or people talking or dogs barking, it's because I have the window open. It's quite a hot day today, and thought I'd leave the window open whilst recording. Normally I close my window and close my curtains and try to dampen all of the sound, but it's just a little bit stuffy in the room today, so excuse any outside noise you may hear. There's a bit of tapping from a fence panel that's blowing in the wind, so try to ignore that if you can. Now, I make sure that I look carefully at the photo reference and scrutinize what I've already drawn in case there are any other tweaks that I can make. And at this point, this is definitely the darker pencil, where I'm adding the shadow as opposed to the mid-tone, and this will add a lot of depth to the drawing, just as it has on the two hands above, but I think it's a bit more impactful with these two hands because of the strength of the reference, I suppose. So I make sure not to cover too much of the hand with the darker shadow hatching, and the reason being, it's not going to be as impactful if it's all over. You want a combination of both the shadow hatching and the mid-tone hatching in order to suggest levels of shadow which are being cast on the shape. You do have to make some big decisions, because shadow can be really nuanced into several gradations of darkness, and that's where you have to decide, do I split it into just two, a mid-tone and a shadow? Do I try to introduce a third where it's two mid-tones and a shadow? Or do I have enough range to split it into 4 or 5 different levels of darkness? And for these drawings, I like to keep it to 2 or 3 levels of dark and light. It's my belief that the strength of this drawing is how careful I'm trying to be with where I apply these marks, so that it describes the shape and it doesn't become muddy, which is to say that where all the marks just blend into each other. Instead, I try to have a good separation of one type of shadow with another. I'm going to be doing the same thing on this other hand. And it's just being careful, checking your reference, and then creating this level of shadow within the hatching. What I'm doing now is creating a little bit of a gap between the edge and the center of the finger, because the darkest part of a shadow is usually slightly inward because of reflected light on the other side. So it is worth trying, if you can, when you're applying shadow to any of the shapes that you've drawn, to leave a little bit of a gap between that and the edge. Now, I haven't on this overlapping finger, but I think it is literally because it's overlapping another finger and it has a different effect. Now, these are just floating hands. I'm not going to have shadow beneath them or try to create any environment around them, but it's just so that I have studies of hands and fists and fingers, so that I have a better understanding of how to draw them from imagination in the future. When I hatch around the outside with darker shadow, I try to make sure I don't do the full length of the lighter hatching. That way you can see the lighter hatching poking out of the edge, and therefore it has a bit of a transition from mid-tone shadow to the darker hatching shadow. Depending on where the shadow is sitting, sometimes it curves around the corner. Made a bit of a mistake there and went a bit too wide on where the outline of the thumb. So just pull it back again and draw it back in. But the shadow curved around the other side, which it doesn't always, but if that does happen, then I'm quite conscious of how much of the shadow is visible. It's usually a thinner covering. So one side will have heavier shadow and the other side will be a very light edge, which has a shadow edge to it. Now I'm sculpting the little finger there on the end to be more narrow than I drew it initially. Once again, get the eraser in just to pull back some of these initial lines that I made. Thankfully, these Mars Lumograph black pencils by Staedtler don't smudge, so you can brush away the little shavings of the eraser and it doesn't smear the marks you've already made. If I'm drawing with ink, I try to do one single stroke of a line, but when it comes to these digits, I am doing small little dashes, as you can tell, and building them up. It's not usually how I like to draw, but on this occasion it worked quite well. Now I'm keeping the outline for the hand quite dark on one side, and I'll try to keep it fairly light on the other side. Just introducing bits of coverage of nuanced shadow shapes, which I may not have seen in the first glance at the reference. It just adds layers of depth and texture to the surface, and it just improves upon the rendering. It's not something I do very often, so I'm not saying that this is in any way how to do it or that I'm especially good at this, but it's something which I'm practicing and trying to improve upon, because I do think that hands are great shapes to get right. You always see artists have pages and pages of hands that they've drawn, and I don't have those. So I'm starting off slowly with concentrated studies of hands and the marks in between. It's not just the shapes of the hands, it's really the anatomy beneath them which is quite important. But as regular viewers will know, I'm more concentrated on tonal values, so it's all about the light and shadow for me. That's what tonal values are: the light, the dark, and the in-between. Now I add some darker shadow to the knuckles here, but it's a bit too dark. I don't realise it at first. When I first apply it, I just think, yeah, this is a separation of the lighter hatching and the darker hatching, which is there in the reference, but it's not quite that dark. And that's something which, once I move my hand away and look at it, I can see straight away that's too dark. So I just dab at it with the eraser from the Blackwing pencil, and that just softens it enough where it's not quite so dark as it was, as to make it look unnaturally deep a shadow. And that has a nice softening effect. I think they're quite nice, expressive hands. As I said, they're not perfect. I have a way to go to get up to the amount of studies that I'd like to do for hands, so that I know them a bit better. But these pencils are really handy as far as the dark and light range which they can achieve. And I used a 2B, and I believe the other one is a 6B. So that is the difference between those two pencils in range. And you can broaden that range so that you're instead using something even lighter than 2B and something even darker than a 6B. But yeah, that's as far as I got. I will be continuing them on the next couple of pages, and I might do some in ink as well, but for the time being I quite like the pencil drawings. Since these don't smudge or leave an impression on the other page, I might even do some on the opposite page that you can see there with the marker bleed on the other side, but I'm not sure yet. I'll make that decision more towards the time. So yeah, that's how they worked out. Okay, so that's the video done. Now, I thought I'd keep it brief and just do those two quick studies of hands, and using these Mars Lumograph black pencils, Staedtler pencils that are kind of waxy, but they go nice and dark. I mean, darker than Blackwing pencils, which is quite interesting for me. So it doesn't feel quite as fun as spreading like a buttery type of nib on the paper, which is what I get with Blackwings. But I do get this range between the lights and darks that I don't get with the Blackwing. So that's the trade-off that you've really got to consider. But yeah, I thought if I keep it brief like this, then I can share the video with you in real time so that you can see the sketch and I thought it was quite fun, a little nighttime sketch session. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, then please leave a like, comment down below, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell, and I will see you in the next video.